Well, I never saw this. There's no paper. I've not seen the presentation, so these are very much off-the-cuff comments. They're just my thoughts that occurred as Hardy was talking. So I'll keep my comments brief, and that will allow more time for comments and questions from the audience. But I have a couple points that I want to underscore. First of all, I want to say thank you for a really enlightening and interesting presentation. I think the whole question of R2A, the right to assist, is something that has very, very broad implications, and they reach much further than orientation towards nonviolent action, but are extraordinarily relevant to that. What I want to do, though, is I want to back up and put a frame to what this presentation is about and what R2A is all about and what nonviolent movements are about. Now, what's nice about the presentation is that Hardy starts with the logic of what nonviolent movements are all about the problem of collective action and getting the groups together, getting people on the street, the need for large numbers, huge numbers of people become critical to the success of these movements. So the problem of getting around a fundamental collective action problem is incredibly important. Normally, especially if there's any threat to my physical being, the discomfort of being out on a protest, potentially a life-threatening environment, these are going to be very difficult. And they're ones in which the more people that are out in the street, the easier it is for me to join. The fewer the people, the more risk and the greater the cost that I will bear as an individual. So there's millions of people out there. It's not that much of a difference for me to go out or not. But if there's 10, then it's a huge difference. Now, I underscore that because what I want to get to is a fundamental aspect of all of the logic here is one of a grassroots orientation. And it's one in which individuals are making a decision to participate or to not participate in the movement. Do you go out in the street or don't you? Now, that mindset of the individual and the grassroots, or what Hardy refers to as bottom up, is the essence of what he's referring to. Now that creates a very interesting way of thinking about R2A, how to assist a grassroots movement. Normally, when you're looking at this and we think about assistance in external environments, we think of two major types of actors. We think of official international organizations like the ones that he refers to, the World Bank, UN, these types of international organizations which have a very strong, they're international governmental organizations. Representation is by governments. The other is states themselves, nation states provide support. The essence of both of those actors interacting is not bottoms-up logic. That's elite-driven logic. So one thing to think about, and this is a way to move in our thinking, is what do we mean by who's the actor involved in A? Because the recipient, given all the logic, is on the ground. That's a grassroots. But who's representing those people? What's going on the ground is another thing. But we need to think about that. Now, what it leads me to think about is often the organizations on the ground are led by non-governmental actors of various stripes. And it seems to me that continuing the logic, it's NGO to NGO that creates a more natural environment for R2A environments to thrive, because we have a natural bottom-up orientation to it. Now, given that, then there are some questions to be asked too, though. Who are grassroots? What constitutes grassroots? So I'm just going to throw out a few questions that I don't have an answer to. But what constitutes grassroots? What is grassroots? what's bottom up versus, it's easy to say what it's not, but it's much easier to define what's not than what is. In other words, I know when something is being driven by the government itself, or it's driven by external actors, as the claim is on the backlash. Those things are easy to identify, but where is exactly the ideal frame for grassroots movement, bottoms-up politics? And the logic depends on that really being the essence, that it's going down to individuals making a decision to participate or not. So that in that framing, I think, is very important, and it helps us frame where we are. I don't think it excludes, though, international organizations facilitating the ability of NGOs to engage with other NGOs. It doesn't prevent a nation state from doing that. And maybe that's more of the particular role that a non-bottom-up kind of logic would be, facilitating those activities rather than that. So that's point number one I wanted to make. Number two is, and this is more of a broader question, and that is, if we think about bottom-up grassroots politics, the essence of what it means to have a nonviolent movement succeed, it's depending on this thing called civil society and the development of civil society. And all of us have some feel for what civil society is, but again, what's civil society and what's not civil society is hard to identify, and it would be very, very useful for us to be able to better identify what that means, and what's elite and what's grassroots. And I think a lot of times these things are going to be, there are counter-elites and there are elites, and counter-elites will find it in their interest to say that they're grassroots, but where is that boundary, and does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. The other question when we ask about civil society and the development of civil society, can an outside agent do anything anyway? Is this more of a natural process that has to occur in an indigenous environment? When we think about development, is really the development of the connectivity, the ways that people organize themselves, the way that they engage with one another. Those, to me, don't seem like me sitting in Norway that I can point my finger at some country and say, now you guys should get together and really form a more developed civil society. That doesn't seem, it seems preposterous in many ways. So to what degree can an outsider have any influence in the broader way of explaining development of civil society? Now, the third point has to do with what I regard as a fundamental reason for why nonviolent movements succeed. And that is, they succeed because of all those mass demonstrations, but ultimately, what's really important, and you had a point number 3, and it's divide the regime. And more particularly, you get the security apparatus to not fall in line. That you have some, what Erica refers to as defections within the security apparatus. Now here's where your backlash comes in, and that is, to what degree, by engaging in R2A, do you make it more difficult for an agent of the security apparatus to defect? And so that the framing by the regime becomes critical. And so I think that there is an aspect of any individual organization, and I'm going to use that word to keep with a bottom orientation, is to think through what are the implications. One can never know, but to what degree am I going to create an alienating environment where it would create more problems than good, and that ultimately it may be that an indigenous movement is going to be better off than me engaging at all.
First, do no harm.
Precisely. So that you may actually create an environment that you create a solidification of the security apparatus. You never get the defection, and then your chances of succeeding collapse, really. So I'll leave it with that kind of fundamental workability kind of point. And I think I'll let Erica decide how you want to do, if you want to gather questions, or if you want Hardy to
talk. A couple comments, just based on what you said, Scott. Thank you for that feedback and commentary. In terms of recipient organizations and what is or they're not always organizations. They're groups, not always formally incorporated. In terms of recipients, I don't have an exact definition of what constitutes grassroots or bottom-up. But I do think there are a few clear markers when you're talking about, if there's going to be some form of intervention under international human rights law, number one, I think, or under some concept of R2A, number one, you would want the recipients to also, in their mission, in their conduct, abide by human rights themselves. Be inclusive, be popular, sort of exercise, in their exercise of human rights, protect the human rights of others. So I think that's key. Another would be, obviously, be committed to nonviolent means themselves. It goes in conjunction with it. And I think those are obviously two key criteria. And I think also in terms of us trying to figure out how best one might intervene, I think it's critical for external actors to think about a diversity of opinions and views in civil society, and not necessarily try to pick winners and pick, oh, these are the groups we're getting behind. That kind of stuff can become divisive very, very fast. In terms of the kinds of roles that external actors can play, I think funding can be very problematic. Funding can divide a movement. People can get into fights over who's profiting this and that. It can lend a lot of credibility to regime propaganda. And frankly, I don't think it's that important often, because civil resistance is not a like capital-intensive enterprise. Movements don't fail because they don't get funded. That's not why they fail. They can fail for lack of strategy, lack of unity, lack of vision, other things, but I don't think funding is really the thing. And this is where movements differ from organizations, because organizations have budgets and paid staff, and they need a certain level of funding. Movements, I'm talking about things like, for example, helping activists meet with other activists, like promoting peer interaction. For example, one of my friends and colleagues, Ivan Marovic, who was one of the founders of Otpor, met with other activists in the late 1990s from Slovakia, and he said that was incredibly helpful information just to get from them. And so if third parties can play the role of conveners of trying to get peer exchange, that can be useful. I think a lot of things that movements do, that third parties can do, are actually of indirect support rather than direct support. When they get into, this is the movement we're behind, I think the kind of risks that Scott identified skyrocket. But if they can create enabling environments, information exchange, my NGO, we promote research, translate it, and share it with people. That's not because we're getting behind any movement. We're saying this information should be universally accessible. It's up to people what they want to do with it. So those kinds of roles, though, I think can be helpful. Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. So we'll turn to the audience now, and if you'll just hold your hand up, I'll acknowledge you, and we'll start with questions. And please introduce yourselves when you do. You first, sir.
Hello, my name is Audun Herning. I'm from NPA, Norwegian People's Aid. Just short, that's the Norwegian labor movement's international solidarity movement. So our first mission was solidarity in Spain in '36, and we've been going on since then. My question is, it's first of all very interesting. Well, President also read some of your work earlier. I think it's very interesting when you talk about civil resistance movements. But my question is also a little bit before we get to that point of actually creating a resistance movement. Because these movements, they don't spring out of nowhere. They come out of organizations. They come out of all the local groups, all the local work, all the places where organizers train, organize, mobilize, and well, learn the craft, or also just gather strength. And these organizations are, I would say, even more prone to hijacking by well-meaning international organizations, UN system, and everyone else. Mostly also because we see these very strong groups in developing countries, in weak states, and we see here's a perfect vehicle to implement our democracy vision, or women's rights vision, or human rights vision, or whatever. So we take away their opportunity to actually organize people to do change. Mm-hmm. But my question is, when it comes to before we get to the movement phase, when we start just by the organizing in local groups. My own organization's history as part of the labor movement has always been a history of support, learning, support both financial, organizational, or in the case of strikes or anywhere else, like political. We always learn from each other, and from a political background, learn a lot from people. I'm 100% sure there's so much learning been done in these organizations in the last 100, 150 years that it could be possible to benefit also organization in developing countries. But what do your research say about this balance on the experience of civil society organization and how it's possible to implement in more development settings?
Should we take another
ahead.
question?
Or yeah, I'll take another question. Trond?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. First of all, welcome.
Thanks, Trond.
Good to see you again.
Likewise.
Trond Botman, I'm here as a private individual, not representing anyone at the moment. I'd like to start off where Scott finished, about what sort of assistance to give and who should give it, because I think it's obvious there should be an R2A, a right to assist, not necessarily a responsibility to assist. And I concur with everybody who says that it should rather be, say, civil society to civil society assistance, because that doesn't play into the narrative of foreign agents so much as if foreign states actually assist directly. I'd also like to say that one form of assistance that I think can be particularly effective is the protective presence. That actually people go and be present at actions to protect those who are there, or to protect human rights defenders. Peace Brigades International, the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program, Palestine and Israel, Nonviolent Peace Force, etc., etc. I agree, much more effective than funding. My question regards a statement that was made in the latest issue of Bistandsaktuelt, a magazine for Norwegian development aid, by the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Göran Kalmyr, from the Progress Party. Because this was exactly about Norwegian assistance to NGOs fighting against international companies in Central America. But his comment was that we cannot or should not in Norway give assistance to organizations that break the law. And this becomes for me hugely problematic, because so much of nonviolent resistance, which is legitimate, actually breaks the law. So if that's going to be the new policy of the Norwegian government, there is a lot that Norwegian NGOs do in terms of assisting NGOs in other countries that would not that could not continue. So I'd just be interested in hearing some of your arguments and opinions. How would you counter such an argument? I'm basically countering it, saying we should draw the limit not with breaking the law or not breaking the law. We should draw the line between using violence and not using violence. But what would be your arguments in favor of saying a government has to allow its civil society to assist civil society in other countries, although they break the law, purely using nonviolent means?
Sure. Thank you for those great comments and questions. Let me just go back to a slide. To the first question, in terms of taking the practice of those who have waged movements and trying to take it to, if I heard your question correctly, and correct me if I did, the last part of it, and take it to other contexts. One of the interesting pieces of history that I recently learned through a friend and scholar that I know, Mary King, she did extensive research on the diffusion of knowledge from India to the United States before what we popularly know as the civil rights movement. There were boats going back and forth, bringing black future civil rights activists and current civil rights activists to India for periods of study and going back, and taking this knowledge to the, quote, developed United States world. And I think that's just one example of so many where you can see peer exchange being valuable, and where what I've seen consistently is that movements need unity, planning, and discipline to succeed. And whether that happens in a state that has a very different structure than another state economically or politically, those core fundamentals are pretty constant throughout, whether it's a local campaign or national campaign. And how they're achieved and how people think strategically about those, I think, is also very cross-applicable. One of the things that my organization has done, and I think will increasingly try to do, is also, we don't just look at these movements from a social science perspective and say, okay, let's try to find good research on them or support good research so that research with the purpose of trying to give activists good information. We try to take the insights of activists that we interact with and bring those to academics and the policy community and others and say, listen up, this is what people on the ground are saying. And also, again, to try to get that peer-to-peer. So I definitely don't see this as necessarily a one-way, oh, they need help, let's give them help. Not at all. I do really see it as a mutually enriching interaction from which we can learn a lot. And to Tron's point, very interesting. I agree with you on protective presence. This is exactly the kind of assistance I'm talking about, where it can be incredibly powerful. It can create an enabling environment for people to exercise their rights and not necessarily be labeled as, oh, this government's doing this to try to achieve that. This is an NGO. These are ordinary people risking their lives to be in a conflict zone so that people might be free to be able to exercise their human rights. I think the comment about not being able to give aid to organizations that break the law, of course, well, then the question is whose law? Is it international law or domestic law? Right, and domestic law, as we know, can say anything, right? Anything. And the most absurd laws get passed. And so if that's your only barometer, what does human rights law even mean anymore? What does human rights law even mean anymore? I think what I observe, and again, I'm not an international human rights lawyer, human rights are under attack in a major, fundamental way right now. The whole concept of human rights law and, like, does it even trump some absurd local law that might be on the books is a huge issue right now. And the reason why I named these two, quote, norms that are being advanced is because no one's naming them, but this is what's creeping in. The idea that even nonviolent resistance might be terrorism, you might be a foreign agent, you might be this. These are basic human rights that are guaranteed under decades of international law. And they should be protected. And protecting them means that sometimes you have to show solidarity with those who are exercising them. And sometimes it means that even if it breaks a domestic law, you know what? There are higher laws than just the domestic laws, particularly when those domestic laws were put in place by a government that does not get consent through elections to represent its people. So anyway, I don't want to get on like a stump and start shouting or anything, but human rights are under attack. No one's going to say, those who are attacking it don't say that directly. They say, we're very reasonable. We just want, more sovereignty, non-intervention, this and that. No, those people, you can't trust them. Look, they're disrupting things. Václav Havel consistently referred to disturbing the peace, but disturbing the peace nonviolently, because the peace he was living in was a dead peace. It was a peace where people didn't have rights. It was a stability in which people couldn't exercise their own development. And through creating a disruption to that stability, he ultimately, not him personally, Czech society created a much more sustainable long-term stability in which people did have more rights. And that's how I see nonviolent movements. They do create disruption. They do create, quote, instability in the short term, but often, and not always, create longer-term stability if we look at the trends. That said, there are cases in which democratic consolidation doesn't occur. There's a risk of civil war, as we've seen in recent years. These are extremely high stakes, and arguably trying to prevent the slide into civil war is actually another role that external actors can play that could be constructive. Is the one opinion I do have I don't give advice, is to really, really drive home the benefits of remaining nonviolent when people are considering, well, maybe we should start going down a violent path, and saying, look at the literature, look at the case accounts of what's happened when that happens.
The woman in the back.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. You didn't say very much about the actors who would or might be involved.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to say that there are actually quite a few actors. And the major actors who've been involved, certainly not the international community or the international community in the form of the UN, because because the UN consists of exactly those countries that you think are breaking the law, rightly so, as well as others. So the usual suspects in terms of helping are the small European countries and Canada, and they are the countries that have no concerns about breaking laws that we don't consider legal. They are very concerned about implementing international human rights, and as you were saying, there's one law, and that is you do not support violent groups. Now that was very difficult, for example, in Africa, both the SWAPO and ANC, which were strongly supported, but they had, for that reason, two wings of their organizations. One was the armed one, and one was the non-armed, and the non-armed was the one that was being supported. But for example, if you go to the ministry, either in Stockholm or in Oslo, you will find programs for female human rights supporters. You will find a great many programs that are not exactly popular in the countries where they're implemented, but they're actually quite important. So I think you should not underestimate that states that consider themselves to be defenders of human rights can be legitimate and very important in precisely the kind of activities that you say NGOs. Now it's true that there are of course also many important NGOs, and this young man was talking about Folkehjälpen, but I think that almost every large Scandinavian NGO engages also on the side in those kinds of activities that you are talking about, and they are usually the best informants also for our own governments as to what's going on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Musa. I'm coming from the Burundian diaspora. I just have two questions and two ideas to what you just said. You say that sometimes it's believed that the external forces can shape or control movement, which you think that's totally biased. But I think sometimes it's a lot of thinking about all the ideas in a Western perspective, where you have, like in Norway, an organization goes to the government, give them money, which we call shopping solidarity. They're going to do things according to the norms, and you have countries like mine, which openly is turning the hand to get 50% of their budget, and you have NGOs totally begging every embassy. And of course, we know that geopolitics is in place. We have many interests around, and I won't rule out that one big corporation or country can go through the NGOs to be able to force the agenda, of course, with the terms that, you know, the good forces come from within. To deny that would be maybe not being aware of some other realities. And again, another question is when we talk about regimes, who defines regimes? And who classified them first-class regimes also plays a role. And I think there are politics in this, but what I can agree, R to A is very important to think about, because we need them, and it should be assistance. If the government cannot even assist the organizations to play the role it can't play, then somebody should give the solidarity hand. But though I think that also, not only in third world countries, I think also the experiences have shown us, even the most developed country like United States, we saw what happened in Ferguson, when everything is kind of systematized and openly people have been denying their basic rights. And then, do we call those, let's say, states or local authorities authoritarians or regimes? No, we don't. And I think if we want to drive a campaign which is fair, we should also not choose sexy words for some others and other words, which are kind of stamping people, because those people trying to give stamp, they're the ones you want them to come up. And though we know that psychologically, anyone, we say that if somebody is struggling, it's good to give him a place where he can say, yes, I can master something. I can do some, to be able to come out from where we want. And there, I think, will be helping those who need assistance and those who are trying to oppress them. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make a couple comments, starting with yours, and then I'll take the previous comment. Thank you. I am somewhat uncomfortable with labeling certain regimes as authoritarian regimes and non-authoritarian regimes, and yet I did it throughout my talk in part for the sake of simplicity. There is, of course, the question of who gets to label whom. My government has been no friend of nonviolent movements in our history, necessarily in many cases, though in some cases it has. And governments are obviously diverse. So parts of the US government, for example, were very critical of the civil rights movement and really tried to label it as externally backed and all the things that we actually hear, sometimes coming from various other governments. Other aspects of my government simply wanted the civil rights movement to go away. And some aspects of my government actually decided, okay, we need to step up and engage the civil rights movement and actually provide some form of protection through the military actually coming and accompanying them in certain cases, though I would argue, of course, the government never would have done that unless the movement basically forced them to say, look, pay attention or you're going to pay a huge political cost. I mean, the labor movement in the United States was bloody, before that in the 1930s. So my government itself and many other quote, advanced democracies are quite uncomfortable with their own nonviolent movements that can happen in their own backyard, and no government likes being challenged by a movement against corruption. So in this case, you can see in any context a government can start to shift against a movement. Now, just because government has done that against a movement in this country, does that mean it never has the right or ability to play a supportive role somewhere else? I mean, these are difficult questions, and who gets to label who is a difficult question as well. I'm not sure I have the easiest answer for you on that. When you talked about funding of civil society organizations, I don't know the Burundian context, and I'm sure you're right in terms of the critical role that funding can play and the competition for those funds. On the other hand, I think of, for example, some Palestinian activists who I've talked to who said, all of our best activists leave the movement and get hired by NGOs, and suddenly they're loyal to the NGO and not to the movement. We lose their talent. We get brain drain. We don't get them committed to our movement anymore. So from a movement perspective, funding can be damaging in a lot of ways. And so it is tricky. Like, yes, an organization gets funded. That's critically important. But does that take people out of the community where they might arguably have more impact? And so, again, I don't have an easy yes-no answer, only sort of more problems to consider. On your comment, I think where I'm coming from as a U.S. citizen, of course, and with a long history of U.S. engaging in all kinds of interventions abroad, many of which were, shall we say, ill-conceived and destructive, is when I talk about government intervention, I'm very cautious. And I think where I'm coming from a different government, I might be able to speak in a different way about the role of governments. That said, the U.S. has done some good things too abroad, and and so it's again, states are not monolithic. There are different actors, especially in a government as large as the U.S., some of which are various aspects of the U.S. government are working in direct contradiction to each other in a whole host of countries around the world. And State Department and Pentagon can't agree, and development agencies and others can't agree, and sometimes they don't even know what they're doing because it's so vast. So these are not monolithic, and states can do good things in some places and bad things in other places. And I think in terms of the role of states and how I conceive of them in an R2A kind of setting, one example that has been very inspiring to me has been the example of the Helsinki Accords, signed in 1975 by 35 states, many in Europe and the United States, Canada, and then the Soviet Union. And the Helsinki Accords guarantee the Soviet Union territorial recognition of the Baltic states. Okay, we recognize you, they're part of the Soviet Union, and recognize that we won't intervene there. And in exchange, the Soviet Union recognized that, yes, actually, though, people do have a right to self-determination and that there are some basic rights that are fundamental to people. And after Helsinki signed, you would think, well, the Soviet Union got the realpolitik victory. They got territorial recognition, and they got a guarantee of non-interference. But actually what ended up happening is that that accord created political space by having the Soviet Union recognize human rights, and suddenly they had to be held accountable for that, and monitoring organizations could spring up and say, hey, you've signed this, and we're going to start monitoring a little bit. Charter 77 is an example. What later became Human Rights Watch is another example. And so I think states can create enabling environments sometimes simply by bringing issues of human rights to the agenda, not just as a nice ideal, but as actually something that if you understand the process of nonviolent change, when people get rights, they exercise them, and the kind of process that can set forward tends towards peace, stability, and democracy, though not always. Nothing, of course, is 100% guaranteed, but when you look at the alternatives of how to get some kind of transition out of oppression, movements are often, I would argue, in many ways, the most effective. And so creating enabling conditions, not direct support, I think is a key role for states. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I like the comments from the gentleman. What is the civil society? Because I'm Anselm from Burundian diaspora, living in Denmark. The right to assist should be, and there is also this right to interfere on the political side, to interfere in internal affairs, which is discussed on the political side. And then it may mean the same with the right to assist when it is civil society. What I want to underline is that the people should be aware that all the people are not on the same level, on the same rhythm. There are countries where civil society is just like on the beginning. And here, when we are here, we think that we are on the same level. The best assistance, I think, should be to give further the knowledge of what should be the responsibility, the role of the civil society. It should be, in my understanding, the best assistance that should be given to some of the countries. You can meet people on the road who are demonstrating, and they have never been aware of non-violence, never been, until they are on the road demonstrating, and those who mobilize them say, you are going to demonstrate against the regime non-violently. And today, they are going to demonstrate. They don't know what is non-violent movement. And at the end of the day, they become maybe nervous, and they begin to maybe to burn the tires in the roads, and and it's, maybe it is non-violent. I don't know. The best assistance, I think, should be to teach civil society in a lot of countries what is the role of the civil society, and then work, know how to cooperate.
Right.
We have time for one more quick question, and then we'll give Hardy the last word.
I just have two comments. I was thinking about what you said about Norwegian minister saying that international assistance cannot be provided to those who are breaking the law, and I think he could be challenged by saying that Norwegian people, an actual Norwegian state, did provide assistance to those people who were breaking the law decades earlier, and one could probably refer to Polish solidarity movement and anti-apartheid movement. So actually, his words are contradicting the Norwegian people's and state practice in the last 2 decades. Another comment I have about what Scott said regarding whether the R2A can lead to unintended kind of consequences, for example, solidifying security apparatus. From the studies that we did at ICNC and beyond, oftentimes the solidification of security apparatus occur because of the violence on the part of the movement. So in theory, one possible response to the challenge about the positive impact of R2A could be if R2A was to reinforce nonviolent discipline of those who are challenging repressive governments, and if nonviolent discipline is correlated with the defections, that might be one way to go. And then building on that issue of R2A, a kind of argument for the emergence of that norm could be that right now international community is driven by, or the interventions of international community is driven oftentimes by R2A, I mean R2P, responsibility to protect. If such a, and there are controversies around that, but what R2P oftentimes lead to is actually discouraging to a certain extent nonviolent discipline. At least oftentimes we see in the cases where R2P was exercised was when opposition turned to violence. And then, of course, opposition being much weaker militarily than the state, kind of led to the disproportionate response by the state, violent response that affected civilians, and that when the international community suddenly made calls for R2P. That happened in Libya, that happened in Syria. So we have the existing international norm that somehow, ironically enough, is encouraging the kind of violent challenge to the violent repressor than the non-violent challenge. And perhaps to counterbalance that, the R2A, right to assist, that could encourage non-violent discipline and engaging violent regime through non-violent actions might be a certain way, to balance what the norms are and norms that we have. So R2A vis-a-vis R2P.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll respond briefly to your comment, and then I'll just say a couple things in closing. First of all, thank you. You started, if I heard you, by talking about, well, what I heard was, couldn't R2A be used as a way of furthering agendas, domestic, internationally, of certain states? And yeah, huge issue, right? Huge issue that potentially it could be abused. Of course, already states are doing it and abusing it anyway, even though there's no R2A. I think one way to get around it might be the development of an institution that would be multilateral, at least on the state side, that would sort of have some adjudication and decision making about what was permissible. So you might get 10, 15 20 member states as part of that, and that would hopefully diffuse the pushing of a particular state agenda under a doctrine of R2A. You also mentioned that you think the education about what civil society's role should be is critical, and I would agree with you completely. In the research that, the strand of research I have focused on for my professional career has been, again, on choice, strategies that work and strategies that don't. What that means is that, from my perspective, a key influencer or factor in the outcomes of grassroots mobilization and movements, whether it's against a local corrupt official, environmental preservation, or something much bigger like, democratic progress in a state, skills matter. And knowledge builds skills. And you can make better decisions when you have better information about here's what worked there, here's what worked there, here's what's worked there, here's what the research says. So I think education and information exchange is one of the most critical things that external actors can do. It's what my organization does, not coincidentally. And it's also doesn't have to be direct about, oh, we're giving it to this movement, but not anyone else. No, you post it online, it's free, anyone can have it. You're not supporting any movement. You're simply making the resources available because it's basic scholarship or basic activist manuals or insights produced by activists in other places that is free information. Or, another role that CSOs can play is translating that stuff into other languages. Really critically important. One of the most important things I think that can be done. In other words, I agree with you. I think I want to thank you all for coming. As I said earlier, the whole concept of R2A is one that I kind of avoided for a while. It was a conversation that I felt, well, does this play too much into authoritarian claims that these are externally backed, or does this play too much into this or that? But what I've really discerned over the last 15 years is that there are costs to not talking about it too. There are costs to not naming it. There are costs to sort of letting this backlash continue without a really clear, coherent response, both from a legal side as well as just, if you don't have something to push on, you don't really have an organizing principle around which to say, how do we coordinate action? And my feeling is that the burden of proof should be on states that want to shut down space, want to repress human rights, and want to say, and it's our sovereign right to do it, and you can't intervene. The burden of proof should be on them, clearly. They do not have, there are big pieces of international law that don't support what they're doing. And I think R2A can start to shift the burden of proof to them, rather than have the burden of proof be on those who want to provide some form of solidarity or assistance, or something as simple as simply giving a translated resource to people in another country. The burden of proof shouldn't be on them to say, oh, or is this okay to intervene? The burden of proof should be on those trying to block that, to say why it's legitimate, why their actions are legitimate. And I see R2A as a critical part of starting to shift that conversation. Thank you very much.